and thank you for joining us on day 3 of Dublin Climate Action Week, and welcome to today's discussion with Dr. Sinead Walsh, from fighting Ebola to fighting climate change. This afternoon's webinar is just one of over 70 online and in-person events as part of the inaugural Dublin Climate Action Week 2021, and I'd urge you to check out the other events this week on dublinclimateactionweek.ie. This week has been organised and delivered by a partnership of Dún Laoghaire-Rathdown County Council, South Dublin County Council, Dublin City Council, Fingal County Council, Codema, Dublin Energy Agency, and the Dublin Climate Action Regional Office, CARO. The overall vision of Dublin Climate Action Week is to highlight Dublin's climate action progress to its citizens and demonstrate the leadership role of the 4 local authorities in conjunction with other partners. For those of you that don't already know, each local authority has a climate change action plan, and you can see them at dublinclimateactionweek.ie. My name is David Dodd, coordinator of the Dublin Climate Action Regional Office, one of 4 CAROs funded by the Department of Environment, Climate and Communications to work directly with local authorities to drive climate action at a local level. And you can find out more about the CAROs at caro.ie. You can also follow Dublin Climate Action Week events on social media using the hashtag DCAW21. A reminder, if you have any questions that you'd like to put to Sinead this afternoon, please include them in the webinar Q&A and we'll try and get to as many as we can. So to start, I'm delighted to welcome and introduce Dr. Sinead Walsh. Sinead is currently Ireland's Climate Envoy with the Department of Foreign Affairs. Prior to this role, she served as the EU Ambassador to South Sudan. She has worked for Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs since 2009 and previously served as the Ambassador of Ireland to Sierra Leone and Liberia and the head of Irish aid in these 2 countries. Before joining the government, Sinead spent 10 years in the NGO sector. She has a Master's in Development Studies from UCD and a PhD in Social Policy from the London School of Economics. She's also the co-author of Getting to Zero, a Doctor and a Diplomat on the Ebola Frontline. Sinead, thanks a million for being part of today's discussion. I appreciate you are a very busy woman, so thanks a lot.
Sure, David.
Thank you. So I suppose when we were planning the events for this inaugural week, I was actually reading your book, Getting to Zero, so it struck me as a good idea to try and get you to speak at this particular event, and we'll share a slide of that now for those of you who haven't seen this particular book. And I have to say, I thought it was a really honest and open account of yourself and Dr. Oliver Johnson's time spent in Sierra Leone in 2014 during what was, at the time, the most widespread outbreak of the disease in history. It really was a fascinating read, so I'd urge anyone in the audience to read it. I also noted that the proceeds of the book are going to St. Joseph's School in Makini, if I pronounced it correctly, in Sierra Leone, a school that supports children with hearing impairments and disabilities. So fair play for that, particularly humanitarian gesture in terms of proceeds. I know it's Dublin Climate Action Week, and most of the events are very much Dublin related or local related, but I just felt that there was a nice link in terms of your book and your current role in terms of climate action, and also I suppose the role of Ireland in terms of aid and climate action abroad. So can I ask you maybe just to start about your time in Sierra Leone? It struck me that I suppose whilst Ebola is a completely different virus to COVID-19, but some of the experiences that you've had and we've all had over the last 18 months here in dealing with COVID in Ireland must have struck a chord with your own experiences during the Ebola outbreak in 2014.
No, absolutely, David, and I'm delighted to be here as a Dub, as a Northsider. Yeah, just delighted we're having our own Climate Action Week. So thanks for inviting me. Actually, I was in South Sudan for the first 6 months of the COVID situation. That was before I moved back to Dublin. So, I mean, I don't work on COVID now in Dublin, of course, but I did almost exclusively work on COVID in those 6 months, and that was actually very linked to, precisely as you say, the kind of lessons from the book. And it might sound like a strange thing to say in the context of an infectious disease crisis, but I actually felt like it was a privilege to have the opportunity to work, to have spent, I spent 5 years in Sierra Leone, 2 years of that was entirely taken up with Ebola. And then I took a year off work to work on the book, which of course took a few years all in all. And then I moved to South Sudan, and there's another infectious disease outbreak. And I was just thinking to myself at the time, probably not that many people get an opportunity to work on something, really delve into the lessons, and then have something very similar happen again in a not very different context. So in that sense, I got to sort of, I suppose, think very practically about the implications of some of the lessons from Ebola on COVID, even before I moved back to Ireland. And I think some of the things that were really useful, I mean, the first was a sort of a no regrets approach, that, in terms of an infectious disease crisis, of course, it's all about speed, and, and that was one thing. So that was really, I kind of pretty much, you could ask my deputy about this. I mean, I kind of dropped everything else. I kind of said, okay, everything else you do, because I have to do this.
You have to focus on this. Yeah.
If COVID does what Ebola did and just totally takes over, life and livelihoods and society and the economy, then we will all regret that we didn't focus on it early enough, as we did in Sierra Leone a few years before. So that was the first thing, is just a no regrets approach. But also I think some of the useful lessons were, what we found in Sierra Leone on Ebola was that some of the measures that we brought in to try to curb the disease were actually more of a problem for people than the disease itself. So when we put people into quarantine, we had lockdowns and so on, it's not like having a lockdown in Ireland. There was no social welfare, there was no PUP, there was no calling SuperValu to get your groceries delivered because you couldn't go out. This was a situation where a lot of people only made money on a daily basis. If they worked, they got paid on a daily basis. And so, we really had, an incredibly fragile, I suppose, livelihood structure to work with. And I would absolutely say that is the same thing for less privileged people in developed countries as well. Let's not forget. But there was certainly no kind of state support. So I think that was one of the useful lessons for me, starting to work on COVID, was in South Sudan, we have to protect, we already have this huge humanitarian response for food insecurity and flooding and stuff, which I'm sure we'll come back to, that's climate related as well. So we need to protect that, and not put in so many restrictions that we actually create new problems. In Sierra Leone, more people died from the secondary impacts of Ebola, not Ebola itself. So maybe they weren't able to get to a clinic for their HIV medication. Maybe they weren't able to earn a living.
Yeah.
So it was really useful, I have to say, to have that experience and to try to apply it. And I think some of the lessons from the book are also, I now think, quite applicable to climate as well, but we'll maybe come back to
very much so. Yeah, we'll come back to those later on. Yeah, particularly some of the lessons in the afterword of the book. So I suppose in terms of your current role then, Sinead, you're Ireland's climate envoy. So maybe, like, how did that position come about, and what exactly does the role of a climate envoy involve, sort of on a day-to-day basis, or in terms of travel and countries that you're involved with?
Yeah, well, I suppose I wouldn't really know, right? Because it's a new role, and of course there hasn't been a great deal of opportunity for travel in the past year. But I think it will involve some travel, certainly to the COP, for example, in November. Well, it's a brand new role for Ireland, and it was actually the unit that I run within the Department of Foreign Affairs was actually set up by the Programme for Government in 2020. So it's one of the commitments in there. And that Programme for Government also gave us a few of our jobs. So I think, really there's sort of three big areas, that I'm working on with my team. The first is climate diplomacy, which, is kind of a new thing. I think we are sort of used to, in foreign affairs, we're used to, for example, economic diplomacy and maybe cultural diplomacy, and climate diplomacy is relatively new, but it's just booming, as you can probably imagine. And we have almost 100 embassies and consulates all over the world, and they're, you know, really crying out for, you know, for sort of guidance in terms of how do we, you know, how do we try to make an impact at an international level on climate? You know, obviously people listening will probably be quite familiar with what we're doing domestically. So, and then what do we do at the UN? What do we do at the EU? What do we do at the OECD? So we work really closely, you know, Department of Environment, Department of Finance and others, to try to have, you know, our sort of climate diplomacy priorities, and you know, a few of them, just to give you a couple of examples that Foreign Affairs is focusing on a lot. One is about climate and security, and this is very kind of hot at the moment because we have the presidency of the UN Security Council this month, and we're actually having a big event on climate and security next week, and that's really the whole point of sort of saying, look, you know, there's all sorts of things that cause conflicts and that exacerbate conflict, but climate is definitely one that needs to be considered. We're not saying it's the only one, you know, but it's definitely, you know, we have a lot of country situations in Africa and the Middle East, for example, where, you know, for example, in South Sudan, where I used to live, in fact, also many years ago, I was there with Concern, and then more recently with the EU. You know, you have these very delicate agreements between communities. You know, some will be pastoralists, they'll be bringing around their cows. Some will be agriculturalists, they'll be planting their stuff, and they come up with agreements. Okay, you can, you know, you can have your cows here at this time of year, and then you pass this way, and all, you know, and these are, you know, this is how society, you know, functions with these kind of agreements. All that gets broken down when you have, you know, climate impacts, maybe drought and so on, and so, you know, I suppose I've personally, the climate insecurity, for me, it is just so pressing because I've personally just seen so much of it in practice on the ground. So that's
access to water, I presume, would be a big issue.
Absolutely huge. You know, also recruitment into armed groups, you know, where people, we already know, you know, the climate crisis is leading to more migration, right? So then you have more vulnerable people. So, you know, some of the work that's happened on Somalia, for example, will sort of say, look, you know, these migrants who moved here, there was a lot of, you know, kind of people who were sort of, you know, flung, you know, sort of in a very, very vulnerable situation. Yeah. And then some of the armed groups took advantage of that to try to, you know, recruit some of the unemployed young men, for example. So climate and security, you know, is a really big priority. A second one is adaptation and resilience. I have to say this is something we've been working on for a long time. How do we help, you know, some of the poorer countries in the world adapt, and the island countries adapt
to the impacts. Yeah.
Huge. And then a third one that'd be big for us at the moment is the oceans. And I don't need to tell any Irish person why we would focus on the oceans, but yeah, protection of the oceans, you know, helping again, particularly island states on what we call a sustainable blue economy. Those sorts of things are really big for us. So that's just a few examples of the climate policy.
So some of the opportunities, Stephen, comes into that last one in terms of ocean. So as you said, the blue economy, so like opportunities that might come from climate change in terms of fishing or economic development, etc. Does that come into it as well a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say out of those three priorities I mentioned, I mean, oceans is the one that is the most, you know, kind of emerging for us. We've a certain amount of work on it, particularly kind of helping, you know, helping some island communities. Like we have some programming in Fiji where we help with, you know, kind of, you know, mangroves and that kind of thing, you know, to try to help the communities to adapt to, you know, to the sea level rise and so on.
Okay.
But, you know, I think we still, you know, need to kind of find out a little bit more about where some of the gaps are in the sort of oceans kind of sector, as it were. And I think we'll see a lot of activity on that in COP. It's not a formal COP agenda item, but I think everybody knows that the ocean is just, you know, hugely important in terms of heat, in terms of carbon. And so I think we'd see it become
and future impacts as well. Oh, it's a good segue into, I suppose I'd like to talk a little bit about I suppose, climate action. And I suppose when we talk about climate action, we typically break it into mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation being, reducing our emissions, and adaptation being about, I suppose, becoming more resilient to the climate impacts that we have experienced and will continue to experience. So I know we have a selection of images that Lorna will just share there in terms of some of the climate projects that Irish Aid are involved in host countries. We will start. So on the screen, so we have a project here in Palestine, which is looking at clean and affordable energy for vulnerable communities in the West Bank. So obviously very much a climate mitigation. That one in Palestine, I suppose, being an area that's had a lot of conflict in recent years. In Ethiopia, we have here an irrigation project I won't try and pronounce it, you'll probably pronounce it better than me, but looking at improvements to water catchment in Lake Hawassa and supporting the use of groundwater instead of lake water for irrigation. So again, very much an adaptation related project. Looks very interesting. Another one from Ethiopia is looking at climate smart agriculture, and I suppose there's a lot of buzzwords floating around in the climate change areas, and climate smart agriculture is certainly one, not just in Ethiopia but in Ireland, in terms of increasing productivity but also reducing our emissions. So this intercropping and improving soil fertility, obviously important from an adaptation and a mitigation perspective. A tree planting project, National Smallholder Farmers Association in Malawi, and I think you're going to probably talk a little bit more detail about Malawi in a couple of minutes, but obviously forests have a big, and tree cover in particular have a big part to play in terms of climate adaptation, in terms of shading, cover, biodiversity, but also in terms of their role as a carbon sink. We have a cook stove project in Malawi, which is a particular interest. I haven't worked for an NGO, but back in 2015, myself and girlfriend and now wife, we spent a couple of months volunteering in Kathmandu in Nepal, actually, and cook stove projects were quite prevalent there as well, in trying to get locals, I suppose, to stop pulling down the native trees and cover for firewood, and the cook stoves allowing a more efficient use of wood and also reducing the air pollution inside in the houses as well. So particular interest in that project. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that one. And I think we have a couple more. Tanzania. Yeah, the whole area of seeds, I suppose, in developed countries, massive, and I suppose the role that maybe companies have in terms of monopolies on seeds and how they're sold or reused or not used, and how seeds can be bioengineered to become more adapted to GMOs in terms of drought tolerance, etc. I suppose is a really topical issue, not just in developing countries, but I think worldwide. And I think we have one more in Sierra Leone. I think beautiful picture, this one in the mangroves in Sierra Leone. So obviously the mangroves being a coastal habitat and their importance in terms of coastal resilience, but also in terms of livelihood, because they act as a nursery for fisheries as well, and a buffer for storms and waves, etc. So just a selection of 7 different projects. So just, I suppose, from your own experience, I know you're closer to some of than others, but could you spend a little bit of time talking about a couple of those projects in a bit more detail, Sinead?
Sure, David. I mean, I think our kind of MO is mostly on adaptation. I would say, because I mean, I should say we've been doing climate change, climate action work for years, within Foreign Affairs and within Irish Aid in particular. We've kind of scaled it up now with the unit and with my role and so on, but we certainly had some very strong foundations to work off, and they were mostly around adaptation and resilience, and I suppose the recognition that these impacts are in the now. Yeah. They're not in the distant future. And so, yeah, a lot of what we do, and you looked at the seeds and the intercropping there. I mean, it's also maybe worth mentioning that the Food Systems Summit is happening next week in New York, and that's been a big kind of priority for us as well, because I mean, that's just how do we totally transform how we think about food waste and so on. But I think a lot of our adaptation work is trying also to look at all the other work that we're doing, be it agriculture, be it livelihoods work and so on, even health and education work, and kind of see, what is sort of relevant to, how can these be kind of, climate proofed, as it were. I think in terms of mitigation, it tends to be our focus is really kind of what they call PICO, or you know, very much community level. And I think the Malawi stoves, which you mentioned, are a good example of that, because you know, this comes very much back to the point about co-benefits. You know, you've got, you know, women producing and selling the stove, so you've got an income generation. The stoves use a lot less wood, so women don't need to, you know, travel, you know, sometimes very long distances. Women and girls, I should say, you know, because a lot of times girls get taken out of school, you know, for childcare, for these sorts of jobs. So you've got that benefit as well. Then the air pollution that you mentioned. I mean, we had our own smoky fuel legislation announcements last week, and you know, this is no different. It's just maybe more severe, and you see a very, you know, a lot of deaths of women in Africa based on air pollution. So I suppose it's our focus on mitigation. A lot of countries focus on the sort of, you know, the bigger kind of grid issues, and that's important, and the infrastructure. I think as a relatively small country, we always try to see how can we as Ireland kind of, you know, add value. And I think on mitigation, we tend to go for the, you know, for the programs that are more at the community level. That's not to say they're necessarily small programs, because that Malawi goal, there was a target of reaching 2 million households by 2020, which has already been met.
Okay.
So it can have very big impacts. But I suppose the point is, we often feel like the poorest households get left behind in some of the bigger mitigation programs, which may only then be accessible to the middle classes. So we're trying to kind of come in and say, okay, what about the poorest households? So I suppose you could say that kind of element of climate justice and the, you know, reaching the poorest is maybe the kind of common thread across our work.
Yeah, okay. No, it's really interesting, the local and the PICO, as you said, the community aspect. Like I've certainly seen a couple of programs and documentaries about even the role of small scale solar PV in communities that allow people to charge their mobile phone, which then allows them to access the local market to sell their goods and arrange times for collections, pickups, etc., which obviously, you know, reduces the risks of, you know, going somewhere and someone not turning up, or having to go somewhere and not agreeing your price and then having to come back with your produce and stuff. So even that sort of small scale, it is climate mitigation, because it's providing power which can be used for not just obviously mobile phones, but for other things. So that small scale implementation.
That was in sorry, David, the 2040 movie that I attended as part of Dublin Climate Action Week on Sunday.
Oh, great! Thanks for the plug.
You have yet to attend that movie, and I can tell because that community level solar program is a big part of that movie in Bangladesh. So you will see when you.
I plan to go and
other participants go and see it
on Saturday night in Rathfarnham Castle. Hopefully, I had hopes to go and see it in Newbridge, but we're doing a cycling event with the kids. So, but thanks for that. No, but I'd seen it somewhere else. I didn't realize it was in the movie. But thanks for the plug. Great. I suppose just in terms of an interesting, I suppose a question that I had was, in terms of the countries that Irish Aid support on climate action, like, is there a ranking in terms of humanitarian need, or is there some sort of climate risk assessment that's undertaken to help prioritize the projects and programs in those areas? Like, how are they chosen?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we're trying to integrate climate action into all programs, right? So that's something we're working on at the moment. We've made a certain amount of progress. We definitely have more that we can do. So there's about kind of 10 countries, mostly in Africa, where we have, you know, Irish Aid offices within embassies and that kind of thing. And we have, each one of those will have like a climate advisor, and we'll work with them from my unit to try to help them to sort of do this process. So like, for example, you know, they're involved in a program, you know, to do with schools or health centers, and they might be saying, okay, hang on a second, can we put in solar panels and that kind of thing. So in that sense, you know, it's not so much that we're picking new countries, it's that we're trying to see, okay, how do we integrate this into that existing work.
And do the SDGs fit in there, Sinead, the Sustainable Development Goals? So is there a hierarchy there in terms of this SDGs and climate aid, in terms of Irish Aid's focus?
Well, I mean, we try to work on all the SDGs. It's pretty difficult because, you know, there are so many of them. But we have an international development strategy called A Better World. It's on our website if people are interested, and that has a few kind of top priorities, and climate is one of them, and gender is another, and humanitarian needs. So that helps us sort of shape our overall kind of Irish aid work. And then, as I say, the climate action, we're trying to integrate it into all of it. But then if you look, for example, at my unit, we obviously have our own budget. It's about 12 million euros this year. And we try to then see, okay, what can we usefully fund that is sort of multi-country or global, and can kind of add value in that sense. So we fund a lot of work on adaptation. We're starting to fund more and more work on oceans, for example. We fund things like, we've done a very cool program where it's like a competition for entrepreneurs on kind of sort of projects that are sort of climate and environment positive, and entrepreneurs will sort of compete to win this competition. And actually some of the winners, then we've been trying to work with them to help them to take things to scale. So there's there's plastic recycling, there's all sorts of cool businesses there. And so my unit will focus more not on particular countries, but on kind of global or multi-country programs in that sense.
Okay, great. Thanks. Some good insights there. Maybe you mentioned COP26 earlier on. Maybe just to move to that for a minute or two. I know we have an event tomorrow for anyone interested in COP26 or Conference of Parties 26. It's at 1 o'clock, and it's featuring Dr. Tara Shine speaking with the EPA, Professor John Sweeney, and a representative, John Finnegan, from the Department of Environment. So if anyone's interested in COP in more detail, you can fill in on that. But I suppose climate change is very prevalent at the moment, particularly in the media, given the recent IPCC report. Also in Ireland, we've had the release of the Environmental Protection Agency, Med-Air, and Marine Institute status of Ireland's climate, which I suppose shows the impacts of climate change in Ireland and very much in line with the global issue. And in November, we have this Conference of Parties, COP26, coming up in Glasgow. So I suppose as Ireland's climate envoy, I'm assuming you'll have some sort of key role to play there. So do you have any quick insights in terms of what this year's COP will involve from your own perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot we don't know, right? Because this is the COP that's taking place in a very different environment, and people will probably know that COP last year was postponed because of COVID. So now, to be honest, our first priority for COP is trying to help least developed countries to get there, because there's real issues with vaccinations, there's real issues with hotel quarantine and all this kind of stuff. So there are some sort of pre-COP meetings that happen throughout the year, and we sit in on them along with our colleagues from Department of Environment and the other government departments, because we're all sort of responsible for different topics within the National COP delegation. I'm sure John Finnegan will talk more about this tomorrow. But one of the things we've noticed in these pre-COP meetings is that, I mean, I'll use South Sudan as an example. You had one delegate from South Sudan, and already, because there's participants, the pre-COP sessions were virtual, so you have participants from all over the world. Inevitably, it's 4 o'clock in the morning for somebody. So you have this government official in South Sudan, who has to go and try and find the security guard to open the building, to put the generator on, to get the internet on, to get the internet connection. I mean, it is just mind-bogglingly difficult. So one of the things that we have sort of offered to the least developed countries and small island development states is, if there are gaps in terms of the support that they're getting to get to this COP and to be able to consult amongst themselves, because that's one of the difficulties with these virtual sessions. Those of us from developed countries, it's pretty easy for us. We just Zoom together here, we Zoom together there. Yeah. But they're coming from all sorts of different time zones. They have huge challenges in internet connectivity and so on. So that's
logistical issues.
Logistical. So our first priority is actually just helping them to get there. I think I mean, John will talk more tomorrow, I'm sure, about the kind of the big picture, and the biggest issue is likely to be climate finance, and is likely to be the fact that the developed countries have not reached the goal of 100 billion per year on climate finance to developing countries, which we were supposed to meet by 2020. So that's, I think, the big challenge for COP, and there's sort of huge discussions on that at the moment. I mean, maybe just to say from a DFA standpoint, we lead on the adaptation negotiations, and we'll certainly be, and it's via the EU, by the way. So at the moment we're feeding the Irish position into the EU position, and then the EU negotiators will take the lead. And so for us, it is about trying to have a progressive kind of position on adaptation, that we have, that there's enough finance, that it's concessional finance, and these kinds of things, and that we look at, that we look at the quality of what's going on adaptation. Because I'll just say it's just a lot more difficult than mitigation. When it comes to mitigation, private companies can see profit motives and all that kind of thing. When it comes to adaptation, it is just really tricky. So we'll do that. We'll try to get some, we'll try to be pushing on things like oceans to get, as I said, it's not a formal item, but we'll do side events around that, for example, to try to get, just to keep oceans on the agenda, similarly with the climate and security issues. So that's a few of the things that we'll focus on from the DFA perspective. And then, I'm sure the session tomorrow will go into a bit more detail.
Yeah, I'm sure it will. Yeah, but the analogies to the mitigation and the adaptation and the focus on mitigation, I think is probably similar here. I suppose you tend to see a lot of focus on the shiny eco bling sexy things like EVs and solar panels and heat pumps and electric cars and electric buses, and less so on the fact that we have whatever 100 or 50,000 kilometers of coastline in Ireland, and we're not going to be able to protect every kilometer of coastline. So how do we prioritize which sections of coastline we have in terms of coastal erosion, sea level rise? And that's the same, even more pressing for small island states and soft coastlines in the African continent. So yeah, I think the interesting analogies there, even though we're obviously a wealthy country. So cost definitely going to be an issue, I'm sure. Yeah. So in terms of your experience as an NGO, you worked in the NGO sector for nearly a decade. That's right? Like the role of
David, but thanks. Yeah.
Sorry.
You're making me feel quite old.
The role that they play in terms of I suppose delivering some of the projects in developing countries, could you talk about that for a little bit? So like I'm assuming they have a key role, but and I know they had a key role in terms of the reading through your book, Getting to Zero, in terms of delivery of aid on the Ebola front. So how is it in terms of climate aid?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a key role, and it's particularly this element of the ability. I would say probably two things: the ability of NGOs to really get to the community level and to the poorest households in a way that is often difficult for kind of governments or larger multilateral organizations to do, but also the innovation and trying new things. I mean, like we all have our roles, we all have our strengths, and I think we do see a lot of innovation, a little bit like private companies. We see a lot of innovation coming out from the NGO sector that then can be scaled up, so which is the the kind of stuff that we saw with that cook stoves program in Malawi, that there were really important NGOs there at an early stage. But also I think the voices and the advocacy and the critique is so important, because precisely that closeness to the community level I think is what helps NGOs to be able to to try to keep the rest of us in the system honest and to task. So I think I think it's really critical, and since you mentioned that, I mean, one of the things we were just discussing earlier today was, the same point about the least developed countries and small island development states managing to get to COP and participate in a meaningful way. What about the NGOs? Because with the COVID restrictions and so on, like there is a risk that there won't be that same degree
the representation of them.
Representation. So that's something actually we were looking at earlier today. But yeah, I think they absolutely they need to be there, and much like our own NGOs in the Irish context as well, and Department of Environment are working on how do we also enable that to happen.
Okay, great. See, we've got a couple of questions coming in from the audience. We might come to those in a minute, but an area I'd like to talk to you a little bit about is I suppose climate impacts. I suppose over the last couple of months, you'd want to have been in a cave to not have seen some of the climate impacts around the globe in terms of whether it be floods in Belgium or Germany, or wildfires in the US, and wildfires, and indeed massive wildfires in Siberia, which, you know, didn't really make too much news, but when you look at the scale of them, it's actually mind-boggling. And in a warming climate, you know, we had a projections event last night with you know, with Climate Ireland, with Med-Air, and with the Irish Centre for High-End Computing on climate change projections for Ireland, and these events are likely to increase in the warming climate. So what sort of climate impacts have you seen, Sinead, in terms of your own work? Even, you know, prior, you said the Climate Envoy is only a very recent position, so you're likely to have seen impacts well before your current role, but they were climate related. So what type of impacts are you seeing on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I've been seeing, especially now looking back, probably for the last 15 years. I mean, I've been sort of, you know, living in African countries, you know, for the most part since 2001. Now I'm making myself feel old, David, but but actually, you know, some things I don't think were apparent at the time, but now when I look back, they do seem as though they must have been climate related. A lot of it is about unpredictability of rainfall.
Yeah.
So, you know, farmers, you know, sort of saying, look, we used to have, you know, what's often called, you know, the small rains, you know, maybe in East Africa, it might be in the spring. Then we have the big rains kind of over the, what's the Irish sort of summer period. And they used to be able to predict that, and then to be able to sort of plant accordingly. And, you know, the last, you know, maybe 10 or 15 years, it's kind of gone out the window, and it's incredibly difficult for them then to work around that. Another big thing is flooding. Yeah. I mean, the floods in South Sudan, the floods in Sudan, the floods in Sierra Leone. And again, you know, flooding was not necessarily new for these communities, but the extent.
Yeah, the severity of the impacts.
And I think what's really important to remember as well is this is flooding, you know, in places where the infrastructure in some places is non-existent. So like if you think about Freetown, where I lived for 5 years, you know, about 60% of the population of the city live in slums or informal settlements. So just imagine the floods. I mean, it's one thing, floods in, you know, and we've seen the impacts of floods and flash floods in Ireland that can be really shocking and really difficult. But just imagine when you're living in essentially shacks. Yeah. You know, maybe there's cardboard, maybe there's wood. I mean, you have absolutely no chance. Then you've got, you know, bridges, you know, which weren't very well constructed in the first place, that are collapsing and so on. So it comes right back to the adaptation side. But those, in the countries where I've been, I would say those have been the two big things. Sometimes they have an implication. So there was a very serious landslide in Sierra Leone. I don't know if people remember that a few years ago. So, you know, likely that was also, but again, that would have been related to, you know, to erosion and to the rainfall. So those are the big things that I've seen. And as I say, they're not that new. No. You know, they really have been going back, quite some time by now. So, you know, the urgency of us doing something about them, I think, is, you know, can hardly be overstated.
But yeah, that severity of the impacts, when you think about flooding here, as you say, you know, the discussion is around, well, you know, will my insurance company pay up to get the house redone again? But in the context you're describing, it's the entire settlement has been completely washed away, and the infrastructure of the town.
There's no insurance, there's no government safety net, you know, so there's just so much vulnerability there that, and actually, you know, just since you mentioned insurance, that's one of the things that we're funding. So we're funding an insurance facility for Caribbean island states. So a way for them to get, after climate disasters, a way for them to get pretty much immediate payouts, because the traditional way that we do insurance just wasn't working for them. So we actually, we support an insurance facility that's designed around the climate impact. So that's some of the work that we do as well, is to try to see, you know, it's not about emergency response. This is just like, as in unexpected emergency response. It's just about accepting the climate disasters is going to be more and more part of our daily life. So we need new structures and we need new systems.
Yeah.
We can't just make it up every time. So that's a particularly interesting program that we're supporting at the moment.
Yeah, I saw some of the information on your website in relation to the recent floods in Vietnam in that respect in terms of emergency response. So yeah, similar, I suppose, here, like the role of emergency response and how emergency response is built into that climate adaptation response is important as well into the future. I might jump to a question from the audience at this point, and come back to a couple of other questions later. So hopefully I'll pronounce this, and apologies if I don't, but a question from Saifur Rahman Shaheen. Considering the global north is responsible for over 90% of excess global carbon emissions, whilst the global south disproportionately bears that harmful consequence of climate change. Your thoughts on more accountability to be held on the global north and strategies and how this should be addressed? So it's not an easy question, Sinead, but I'm sure you have some thoughts on it, and I suppose probably COP comes into it as well, that international dimension.
Yeah, no, I think that's Saifur Rahman. That's a really good question. And actually, there's a whole sort of thread of the COP negotiations called loss and damage, and that is, I think, very much coming from the same place as your question. You know, it's kind of looking at, well, what it's looking at is being negotiated, right? But it's potentially looking at things like, you know, compensation, for example, where, you know, countries in the global south are saying, you know, come on, and then countries in the global north are saying, you know, wow, we've no idea where that would end if we started it. So that's, you know, I would say it's more of an emerging area. I think there's still quite a lot of work that needs to be done, and we're very far away from a consensus on that. But I think that's probably the closest thing we have to what you're referring to now. That's on the formal side. I think, you know, less formally, you would have a lot of countries that are kind of saying, look, you know, we acknowledge this, and we certainly acknowledge this as Ireland, that, you know, that the countries that are least responsible are often the ones that are suffering the most, you know, countries like Bangladesh and so on.
Yeah.
And I suppose in many ways that shapes what we do. That's kind of the core sort of, if you want, principle of our aid program, is this kind of notion of climate justice. But I think when you talk about accountability, what you really mean is a more formal process, and that is in pretty early stages, I would say. We are in those discussions on loss and damage, and there will be some of that at COP, but I think I think it's still quite far away from some sort of an agreement.
But it's really something that we need to progress like quickly in terms of that climate finance piece as well. Like, if we are to get accountability, it's likely to translate through finance on the ground for adaptation projects and mitigation projects, really. Yeah.
No, and the 100 billion, you know, it is a source of great frustration to least developed countries, and, well, to developing countries, I will say, as a whole. Because, you know, it's a commitment from 2009. I think it was from COP15, and, you know, we still haven't met it. We're probably about 80% of the way there. I mean, there's different ways to calculate, so there's different views on this, but I think the OECD would have us at around 80 billion. But the point is that was supposed to be a minimum.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's real frustration that we haven't even met that.
Okay, we'll go to another couple of questions. We have a question from Marianne Harris. We have a UNESCO, you said you're a Northsider, so you should know the UNESCO Biosphere Reserve in Dublin Bay. And climate change is a key theme. The UN intend that biospheres are demonstration sites for climate action globally. From your experience, how could we work with other UN sites on addressing climate action?
That's a good question. I think I feel as though biodiversity is kind of coming into the climate discussions a lot more. Now, technically, you have a whole biodiversity set of conversations and a whole climate set of conversations. And actually, the biodiversity ones are due to start in China in October. But what I'm noticing is that the biodiversity stuff is coming more and more into our kind of COP, into COP26 and so on. And I think that'll be very helpful, because a lot of the stuff is the same, and a lot of stuff that's good for biodiversity is good for climate and all that, as you know.
Yeah.
So I think that would help, maybe in terms of bringing us closer together. There's also, I think, a plan to do a biodiversity citizens assembly, isn't there? So I think that might start. It should start in the next 6 months, as far as I know. And I think that if we think about what the Climate Citizens Assembly did, and where that maybe got us, that where we sort of how that pushed the conversation on.
Yeah.
I think there's a real opportunity now in Ireland post-COVID on biodiversity, because I think our eyes have been opened and people are saying, oh, were the birds always like this, and so on, and the wildlife people are like, yes, they were.
It's that co-benefits that you mentioned earlier on. Like, I think, instead of seeing them in silos, as we have a climate emergency, we have a biodiversity emergency as well. Some of the solutions to our climate emergency are fundamentally related to the natural ecosystems that we are all a part of, like whether it be trees providing shades in parks and hot days, or providing, habitats for pollinators, etc., and the role that they play in taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And I think sometimes there can be a bit of a disconnect, but this whole area of natural capital and putting in a figure on the services that natural ecosystems play, I think is a really interesting area, because it at least puts a bottom line in front of some of the number crunchers that are looking at the roles that biodiversity plays. So I think that's interesting. We have another question in from Ian Jackson. From your perspective, living and working overseas in the global south, what is one climate action message you would give to Irish citizens?
Yeah,
all the easy ones today, Sinead.
It's a good question, Ian. Actually, it relates actually to, I just wanted to say one more thing about Marianne's question, which is that some of these sort of more local level programs and sites and so on, one of the reasons they're so powerful is because the climate conversation can be very disempowering, because it can feel overwhelming. It can feel, just too sort of systemic, and what can I do as an individual or as a community and all that kind of thing. And I think that comes back, Ian, to that message. I was at this 2040 movie, as I said, on Sunday, and it's very good. I mean, I would recommend that people go to it, especially as part of Dublin Climate Action Week. But the only thing I said to my friends afterwards was, I'd love to see an Irish version, because I feel like it's so important that we really, kind of see our own role as Ireland in, let's call it, the climate and biodiversity emergency that we declared in the Dáil in 2019. So to use that terminology, because if we just sort of say, oh, well, China and so on, and, even if we do whatever, and then China and the US and so on and so forth. And obviously, if everybody took that approach, we would never get anywhere, right? So it's the classic tragedy of the commons. So I suppose, my message would be, we all have spheres of influence. We all have spheres of control. We're consumers, we're voters, we're volunteers. Some of us have opportunities in a professional capacity, others more personal capacity. So, we have a responsibility, not least to the people who are already being affected in the global south, who have emitted just minuscule amounts of carbon compared to us. We have a responsibility, on the mitigation front, and everybody can do something about that. And it may often not feel like very much, but it adds up, of course, if we all take that kind of responsibility. And that's why, hopefully, in this post-COVID stage, we might manage to turn a corner in terms of how we look at these things. And the thing, as I say, about the 2040 movie is I often feel as though there isn't, you know, there isn't actually sometimes that much public discourse about how Ireland fits into global rankings on some of these kinds of things. And I think if there was, it might help us to be more motivated to do better in the rankings if we knew that we're very low on the rankings of, you know, for example, forest cover, or we're very high in energy use rankings and in carbon footprint rankings and so on. And so I feel like it's useful to have those things broken down. That's why I say the 2040 Irish version. You know, the global stuff is fine, it's useful, but having an Ireland specific one to talk about what are some of the specific challenges that we face in Ireland, I think that would be really useful. If there's any filmmakers listening, maybe you can help out.
You never know. We know someone. A good question has come in here. I was going to segue back to a question about your book again and the afterword, but Patrick's actually put in a good question which aligns with it. So Patrick Belmont has asked, one of the interesting insights from your book was the central role that trust plays in solving complex societal problems. Trust that the problem is real, even when it's not directly impacting you. Trust in the government and NGOs, trust in solutions you may not understand completely, trust among citizens, etc. Sorry, Sinead, it's a long question. Without trust, support and response systems collapse. Seems that the same is true in solving the climate crisis. What more could or should the climate community in Ireland and elsewhere be doing to rapidly build trust locally to globally? So really nice question. And it was actually part of the question I want to ask you about the afterword in the book. So yeah, that trust, that issue of trust, it's key, it's integral really. So, you know, what's your experience being there in terms of analogies between Ebola and climate?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, you know, the strongest way to build trust or to strengthen trust, I suppose, is to act rather, you know, to show action rather than words, right? And so I think being able to show our seriousness, you know, in terms of, for example, our own kind of emissions in Ireland, you know, I think you know that making commitments is great. We need to make commitments, but you know, really just chipping away at the various targets so that we actually meet them, I think is a way to kind of to demonstrate our seriousness. I mean, I was only thinking, David, when we were preparing for, you know, when I was thinking about, you know, the link, because I don't think I've given an Ebola climate talk before, so I was like, how's this going to work, and what are the linkages? But actually, you know, you mentioned the afterword, and it's true that now that I think about it, there's so many kind of obvious links. So if you know, coming back to Pat's question as well, you know, there was a few kind of big lessons on Ebola, and they weren't all sort of equal. I mean, the most important lesson of all, you know, for us was the importance of real community engagement, and you know, and obviously that only worked, you know, when trust was involved. And this was something that on Ebola we just took way too long to kind of cop on to, and when we eventually got better at it, and when we had kind of trusted community leaders being the ones kind of doing the mobilization and so on, as opposed to maybe, you know, kind of external health workers or, you know, the army and so on, which we had sometimes, that made a huge difference. And I think that ties back to, you know, to Marianne's question and Ian's question as well about, you know, kind of the you know, the need to kind of to have people really see this as a personal priority, a community priority, and a feeling of kind of empowerment to do that. And then, you know, some of the other lessons I think are really relevant as well to climate. You know, one of the other lessons was about, you know, the importance of leadership, the importance of politics, which is not, you know, very often talked about maybe in some of these things, but you know, the way in which, you know, either positively or negatively politics can make a really big difference. And so I think, you know, I think we can easily apply these also to the climate challenge. And And yeah, now I'm thinking more prompted by your question, but I think yeah, I think they're good sort of general principles. You know, we also felt very strongly that it was really important to work through government systems, and I think this is really important for climate as well in terms of scale. So it's great to have innovations, it's great to have, you know, kind of you know, and I think private companies can do a lot as well, but you know, we're in such a crisis and it's so urgent that I think we just need to get a much more scale. So, you know, start things at maybe NGO level or whatever, but then they have to
scale up,
mass produced, because we just don't have the time, frankly, to sort of yeah, to do things slowly.
Yeah, no, thanks for your insights there, and again a reminder to people in the audience to check out Sinead's book, and Sinead and Oliver's book, Getting to Zero. We're running out of time here, but I might try and get one last question in before we wrap up. Is again, it's from Saif Rahman. With limited funding, what do you think would be the most important local long-term climate change resilience adaptation measure to prioritize in a resource-limited country such as Sierra Leone?
God, I have to pick one. That's a very difficult question. Geez. I mean, probably from a livelihoods perspective, you know, I think that it's hard to overstate the importance of, you know, the changes that need to happen in agriculture, because, you know, that is actually leading to, you know, food insecurity on a very very much in the short term. So, you know, having it'll look different in different countries, but, you know, depending on which climatic issues you're having, you know, kind of trying to get the, you know, kind of the right seeds and the right arrangements, I think is critical, I think, for a lot of African countries. But, you know, it's hard for me to pick one because flooding,
yeah,
flooding on urban communities. So yeah, and just the kind of infrastructure changes that need to be made are very urgent. So yeah, it's difficult to choose.
Yeah, but I think, like, if we can't, you know, if communities can't feed themselves, you know, well then that's a bigger issue. So I think that link to agriculture and seeds and allowing communities to have their own access to seeds to grow their own crops is extremely important, but I think to prioritize there. So listen, Sinead, we've run out of time. It's 2 minutes to 6, so I think we're going to wrap it up for this evening for day 3 of Climate Action Week. I just want to thank you very much for your time. It's been fascinating. I certainly personally could have talked to you for a lot more. I wish you best of luck with your role. It's only a new role. I hadn't appreciated it was as new as it is. So best of luck with it, and hopefully when COVID restrictions ease a little bit and we get into a better situation, you'll get to see, you know, I suppose a lot more firsthand some of the projects and programs that Irish Aid Department of Foreign Affairs are funding. So there was a couple of questions we didn't get to, so apologies to attendees, but a recording of the panel discussion will be made available on Dublin Climate Action Week. So thanks very much to all the attendees for sitting in, for registering this evening. And again, check out other events ongoing during the week at dublinclimateactionweek.ie, including the COP26 discussion tomorrow and the solar powered screening of 2040 at the weekend. They can be seen on the website, and you can register for those. So Gura Mila Magwif, or thank you in Irish, and have a good evening. Thanks very much.